You're listening to the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, where we speak with founders, CEOs, investors, advisors, experts, and thought leaders in the brave new world of psychedelics and entheogenic medicines. Brought to you by Psychedelic Invest, bringing you unparalleled psychedelic investing data and analysis. Psychedelic Invest is the industry's leading resource for those looking to invest in the burgeoning psychedelic industry. For more information and to access all of the podcast episodes, check out our website at psychedelicinvest.com/podcast. And now, here's the host of the Psychedelic Invest Podcast, Bruce Eckfeldt.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Psychedelic Invest Podcast. I'm Bruce Eckfeldt. I'm your host. Our guests today are Adriana Kertzer and Hadas Alterman. They are co-founders of the Plant Medicine Law Group. We're going to talk to them about the world of psychedelics. We're going to talk to them about the world of law, really kind of understanding where are we in psychedelics from a legal point of view, from a regulatory point of view. A lot of moving pieces, a lot of kind of elements in the psychedelic space that we're going to kind of sort through, give some insight around, hopefully give people understanding of really where are we and potentially where are we going and why the industry is the way it is right now. So with all that, Adriana, Hadas, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Bruce.
Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us.
So why don't we start with just a little bit of background on both yourselves and kind of Plant Medicine Law Group, how you got into the space, like why focus on this area of law, and then we can kind of get into where are we with psychedelics from kind of regulatory legal point of view and go from there. So I'll let you decide who wants to kind of do the background, but let's get a little background to the group.
Sure. I can get started and then I'll give Adriana the chance to talk about the bigger picture of what our firm's been up to lately. I personally have been interested in the expansion of my mental and emotional horizons. The interior universe is what Sasha Shulgin, who is a famous chemist, refers to it in the introduction to his book, PCAL, which I would really recommend to anyone interested in psychedelics. And I've also always felt really sympathetic to the plight of the underdog. And I think that right now, we're coming up on a time in the world where there's so much turmoil, there's so much pain. And I think, very, very specifically, something I think a lot about is the skills we are going to need, the skills the next generation are going to need to cope with the effects of technology is evolving much more rapidly than our human minds can keep pace with. And that's going to cause problems and already is. And climate change is, it's unstoppable at this point. We're going to lose coral reef. The ice caps are melting, and we're going to need serious emotional resilience, tools, skills, support in order to be able to handle all of the challenges that are coming our way. So we are at a very interesting point in human history where our awareness of what's wrong is on high, but our ability to explore our own coping mechanisms and our emotional resiliency and endurance to face problems within and without ourselves is really, really rising. And so what we wanted to do with Plant Medicine Law Group was to create a law firm that would be able to support companies, practitioners, nonprofits, organizations in the space that had the same mission as we do, which is to give people good access to these tools, to these drugs, and to think critically about what is the best type of infrastructure that could support the rollout of this new wave in mental health and spiritual expansion. And those are the companies we work with, and we feel really proud and lucky to be of service to this work.
Yeah. Adriana, why don't you give us a little sense of kind of practically who you've been working with last couple of years, like how played out in terms of actual clients and the work that you're doing with them?
Yep, sure. So I'm Adriana Kertzer, and I was born in Brazil and then have lived my adult life in the United States. And as a little bit of background about how I approach our work for our clients is really a fascination with the gray area that exists between sociology, business, and culture. I started my career as a capital markets lawyer at Simpson Thacher, became a design curator for many years, ended up working for the Obama administration at the National Endowment for the Arts. But if you kind of throw all those titles to the side, what really kind of surfaces is a real desire to add order to chaos in situations where things are very complicated and new and there's a lot of movement. And psychedelics fell on my radar as a cultural reverberation back in 2016 and became a, let's say, legal and professional focus upon meeting Hadas. And it was really Hadas who brought all of these different observations that I had made together when she said, one day over coffee, I'm thinking of starting a psychedelics law firm. And it just was the clearest moment in my mind. And I just blurted out, I was like, you have to do that with me. And so it's funny because it kind of, coincided with me turning 40 and just kind of caring less about what my aunties in Brazil thought about me and caring less about other people's definitions of success. And quite honestly, just saying, you know what? I've been tracking weird shit forever. I'm finally going to put my full kind of professional and personal and public, existence, just kind of let my freak flag fly and really tell people what I'm thinking about. So the way that it really shakes out, day to day is that we day to day service what we call ecosystem building companies. So yes, we have some biotech clients, but by and large, most of our clients are engaging in legal activities that are building this psychedelic ecosystem that you will need in order to have a medical or spiritual or ceremonial psychedelic future. So everything from working with mushroom substrate manufacturers to psychedelic therapy companies that have proprietary technology, virtual reality platforms, scientific research companies, social network platforms that are focused on psychedelic content, many psychedelic practitioners and harm reductionists. And so the list kind of goes on, and we're happy to talk a little bit more about, what this ecosystem looks like now and should look like in the future.
Yeah. So before we kind of dive into that, let's kind of understand, let's talk a little bit, because you have some background in cannabis. I'm kind of curious on how this interplay or how you've kind of approached cannabis market versus a psychedelic market. How has this been similar? How has this been different?
That is a huge question. I would say that essentially the two markets they are completely different in nearly every way, except for a few interesting pieces that Adriana can explain, because I think they are more theoretical and cultural. And she's very keyed into those things, as you can tell. But from an investment perspective, we're talking about two different universes. From a policy perspective, we're talking about two different universes. And I think also, importantly, from a restitution and justice perspective, we're talking about two very different issues. I think that a big part, a really important part of how the cannabis industry was supposed to play out. And when I say supposed to, I don't just mean, that's my belief of how things should happen. This is actually, when you go back and look at legislation and regulation, part of what's written in these state laws and regs is some sort of equity provision that would essentially would serve as some kind of restitution to communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. That hasn't happened in a very sufficient way, I would say. But with cannabis, there is this legacy of communities, poor rural communities and definitely urban communities of color being really decimated by these policies. And so now that this is an industry and legal and something that's very highly profitable, the idea was supposed to be that those communities would be able to be, given their rightful place at the table. With psychedelics, you don't see that as much because although we'll talk about this later, the war on drugs really did stop progress for the most part in researching and applying these drugs. There wasn't we didn't see the same mass incarceration. We didn't see the same targeting of people of color. So I think that, I'll turn it over to Adriana to address how they are similar.
Yeah. So I think that the similarity is that, here we go. I think let's zoom out. Humans have consistently been looking for altered states of consciousness. And so there's a continuum, in many different directions of, alcohol, meditation, exercise, sex, drugs. So I think that, these substances, whether you call them plant medicines or drugs, humans have, for as long as we know, been looking for ways to alter their perceptions for a whole host of different reasons. I do think that where things start getting tricky and where we also treat them differently is that the impact that these different substances have on your soul, and also your ability to consent, and also your ability to protect yourself is just different. And so that is where we often draw a line within the law firm, is to say, cannabis has a certain effect. Yes, you can get really, really stoned, but there's still a certain degree of consciousness and ability to kind of navigate the next steps. And with psychedelics, that isn't the case usually. And so when we work with clients on crafting waivers and protocols for retreats and legal destinations, we really treat it very differently than if you were doing a cannabis tasting dinner. And we take that nuance very, very seriously. However, let's flip that around. A lot of people in the psychedelic community ignore cannabis. And one of the things that we often do, because we are a law firm that straddles, both spaces, is we remind them, when they're anxious and chomping at the bit to do, for example, a psilocybin retreat, we often are in the position to remind them that certain types of cannabis in certain dosages, in certain states, can actually be psychedelic. And that option is legal in, X, Y, and Z states. So there's it's really great that we make life harder for ourselves by having to follow two industries, but it means that we can often remind the psychedelic industry not to ignore cannabis and to just be hyper aware that when dealing with psychedelic clients, the question of consent, the question of safety, the question of protocol, and quite honestly, the role of a therapist or a guide or a shaman is just different and important.
Yeah. And so let's talk about, when we refer to psychedelics, what do we mean? Because I think unlike cannabis, which is a pretty clear, things derived from the cannabis plant, psychedelics is a little bit of a mashup. How do you kind of parse the term psychedelics into these different areas, and why, and how are they similar or different?
Sure. So I'll answer that question, and then you can, if there's something you want me to dig deeper on, let me know. If I go super deep into every part of this, we'll never make it out alive. But basically, so I'll start here. The term psychedelic was coined by a British psychiatrist named Humphrey Osmond, and he was writing a letter to Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World. And he used this phrase. He said, "To fathom hell or sooner angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." And the word psychedelic is a combination of psyche, which is mind, and delos, which is manifesting. So it's mind manifesting or revealing. And that's what it is. Psychedelics are substances that can show you deeper insight into who you are, both the good and the challenging. And the classic psychedelics, or hallucinogens as they used to be called more frequently, are LSD, psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, DMT, which is the active ingredient in ayahuasca, mescaline, which is peyote. And then you have what we would call entactogens or empathogens like MDMA. And then you have ketamine, which is a dissociative anesthetic, and then many, many more. And then I'll just briefly say, because I think this is really important for context, all psychedelics are federally illegal Schedule I drugs. So the classic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and mescaline, those are all Schedule I and have been there since 1970. And that means that the DEA considers them to have no medical value and a high likelihood, high potential for abuse. MDMA was added to Schedule I in 1985. Why it wasn't there before and how it got there is a really fascinating story we can get into if you want. And then the exception to this rule is ketamine, which is Schedule III. And it can, it's used off-label for depression and as an FDA-approved drug called Spravato. It's a J&J drug, actually.
Yeah, so let's I guess from a regulatory point of view, what does that mean? So if something's a Schedule I, what can you do with it and not do with it at this point? So
if something is a Schedule I, you cannot, there is simply there's no way to use it in commerce. You can't buy it, you can't sell it, you can't create it, you can't manufacture it unless you have an exemption from the DEA, or you're doing a clinical trial or some sort of government-sanctioned research, which is happening right now. Yeah. Or you can operate in a quasi-legal zone. And so this is a big cannabis parallel, obviously, where something is illegal at the federal level, like psilocybin, but it's been legalized at the state level. So that's what we're seeing in Oregon, which is the prime and currently the only example, although that's going to change, of a situation where the state has actually voters initiated a ballot referendum in the 2020 election, which passed, something like 75% support. And what it's doing is it's creating a model that we can kind of think of as a hybrid between medical cannabis and adult use cannabis. So it's not actually, let's say it this way, a medical model generally, not akin to cannabis, more like with ketamine, where you go and you get a prescription, you're treated for something, and a recreational model where you don't actually need a prescription, you don't actually need to have some sort of mental illness or diagnosis to be given a prescription. Basically, it's going to be a pretty simple process where you have licensed facilitators, you have licensed centers, and you have licensed cultivators. The cultivators grow the mushrooms, they give them to the centers hire the facilitators guide participants through psychedelic journeys. It's not therapy because they're not therapists. And that's why it's not really a medical model, but it's not really adult use because you're not going to be able to buy a bag of mushrooms and take them into the forest and, just do whatever you want. Although I do think we'll get there eventually.
Got it.
And one of the things that I wanted to add to this kind of conversation about legal and illegal is that the terms are complicated enough, right? Like what does decriminalization mean?
Exactly.
What does legalization, right? Yeah. And what we've noticed at the law firm, given, who contacts us, is that all of the media attention being paid to psychedelics, plus a certain normalization of the gray market on platforms like Instagram, plus the, quite honestly, difficulty for lay people to understand the difference between decriminalization and legalization and how that even touches commerce. What we see day to day is a real confusion among people about what's legal and what's not. Because in the same breath that you see an Instagram ad about microdosing, you see an article on The Economist about, the promise of psychedelic therapy. It's generating an incredible amount of confusion in the market. And I'm curious to see how that's going to continue unfolding. But we at the law firm have to draw a very, very bright and firm line that we do not, aid and abet in any gray or illicit activities. But it just always surprises us how much confusion exists currently because of all of the hype and the capital markets activity and so on and so forth.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, yes, there's a lot of hype and there's a lot of these kind of reports or, coverage that's coming out around changes in state law around some of these things. So it sounds like it's similar to cannabis. There's this kind of gray area of where it's still federally legal and still you're still kind of exposed on the federal side. But for a state like Oregon who's legalized it, that while it's not, I can walk into effectively a dispensary, I can, produce my own and do whatever I want with it. It's still kind of within some kind of container. Like these folks, for the facilities that are providing these psychedelic experiences, like what is their risk? What is the legal basis they're operating under? And then what's the risk from a federal point of view?
That's a great question. So one of the things that distinguishes the quasi-legal zone of psychedelics right now just in Oregon from a similar situation a few years ago, cannabis, is that we don't have a Cole memo. We don't have anything saying what type of jurisdiction the DEA may or may not assert in these types of situations. And, what we do have is the understanding that what happened, well, let me take a step back. So we don't have that certainty. People are taking on an immense amount of risk by participating in this industry, at the underground level, certainly, but also, I think once the Oregon program really hits the ground running, which it will, I think in 2023, we're going to be seeing these businesses fully operational. It's not just the risk from the federal government that's going to be, something that we may or may not need to keep an eye out for. I mean, of course, there's going to be the usual stuff like banking is going to be difficult until this is federally legal, regardless of the posture the DEA takes, things like that. But there's also a lot of other wrinkles to consider when you think about the fact that, sure, these facilitators in Oregon don't need to be psychologists, they don't need to be psychiatrists, but it's helpful if they are. And a lot of people who have dedicated their careers to mental health are excited about this work. They see the potential, they see the efficacy, they understand that this is an important thing to be able to give to their patients, and they want to engage in the work. What we are not sure about is how are medical licensing boards going to view this? How exactly?
I could be really into it, but if it risks my license, it's going to push me away.
Right, exactly. And it's the same question for behavioral health boards. There's also a huge wrinkle with insurance, right? So if you as a practitioner cannot get malpractice insurance or any other kind of insurance to cover you, then what are you going to do? And that's also going to make it more difficult for participants if they can't get insurance to cover the session. So there's a lot of these little wrinkles that don't hinge so much on, I mean, they do ultimately hinge on legality, but they're not so much, are we going to be criminally prosecuted? It's more of, are we going to be able to do this in like a safe and practicable way? Mm-hmm. And I think that, one of the things that we are considering heavily as a firm with our clients, and then also as people who are involved in just the general building of the infrastructure of this industry, is the market will figure out how to deal with insurance. The market will figure out how to deal with licensure. All of those things are going to happen because that is what the market does. It fills space, it fills gaps, and there's something great about that. But the issue here with psychedelics is that if we default to allowing the market to do what it does, then what we are essentially doing is ensuring that the way that this industry is rolled out is parallel to the way, big pharma has been rolled out and cannabis has been rolled out and everything that's come before. And with this, I think that we don't want that for two reasons. The first reason is that hasn't been an equitable way of doing things. It hasn't been a good way to distribute wealth across different communities, and it doesn't always yield the best results for that reason. The second piece is at the end of the day, we're not dealing with widgets, right? Like we're dealing with human consciousness, which is the most fragile, precious, complex thing that I can imagine. And so do we really want to let business as usual, single bottom line thinking dictate and trickle down onto decisions that implicate human consciousness, especially when a lot of the patients and participants are already struggling with their mental health? And the obvious answer is no, we have to do and be and think bigger and better.
One of the things that always fascinates me is how we as a law firm obviously are, limited to only doing legal work and assisting with legal work. But you can't be in the cannabis or psychedelic space without having reverence for the people that came before you and also an understanding of the wisdom that comes from the underground. And in cannabis, we know that because we know the cultivators that were underground had great wisdom in raising the plants. In psychedelics, we know that even though the patent office might not know about the repository of existing known compounds, people in the underground were still researching and recording their findings, and psychedelic guides were, perfecting their craft underground. And now clinical trials that are federally legal rely on this knowledge to carry out their trials. So just to kind of name that all of these kind of increasingly legal industries very much exist as a result of the experimentation and the risk that was taken underground. So that's a really important thing, I think, for us to name. Where things get complicated, kind of following up from that, is this question of once you start drafting regulations, right? Who can sit in the room with someone? Who can lead a retreat? What I worry about is the kind of the neo-shamans, the people that, wear the right hat and the feathers around their necks and therefore are dealing with these substances and don't have training on transference and boundaries and consent. And so one of my personal worries, and also something that we pay attention to in how we talk to clients, is yes, to navigate this tension that exists between kind of who has a title, who has the right letters behind their names, the knowledge that's in the underground, and then kind of where is that all kind of end up in the future? I don't have the answer. We don't act as if we have an answer, but we just really make it our business to stay hyper aware of trends, where the knowledge is, and also where best practices can be crafted. So a lot of our clients don't come to us for black and white answers. They really are often paying us to craft best practices with them for a situation that was once 100% underground and without waivers kind of thing.
Yeah. And what are I agree, like it's a little unclear on exactly how this is going to all play out, because we're dealing with, the legal structure, we're dealing with the therapeutic models, we're dealing with insurance, medical systems, right? There's a lot of players involved in this that need to figure out how they're all going to integrate or work together to ultimately create, how psychedelics are going to be, operated, distributed, implemented, applied. What are some of the proving grounds right now, or the things going on in the world that you feel are really going to be decisive or influential in terms of how that's playing out? You mentioned, Oregon, what's going on there. What else do you see as being, policy issues or, areas that are hot with activity that are going to be influential?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. One, I would say MDMA getting FDA approval in 2023, which is when it's projected to happen, is going to be enormous, because it's going to be the first true psychedelic. If we're categorizing ketamine as a dissociative, which it is, it's going to be the first true psychedelic to be put out to market and to be commercialized. And I think that's going to be really exciting. I think it's going to be really deeply chaotic, because we're not ready from an infrastructure perspective. We're not ready from a human capital perspective, which is something Adriana thinks a lot about. But it's going to be an absolute watershed moment. And I think it's going to be very legitimizing for the movement and for the medicine and for all of the people involved. And then, there's a lot of state legislation in the works. I think a lot of it's going to fail, which isn't great, but it is an opportunity to educate people who would not otherwise know about psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapy. There's a promising bill in New York. There is a reasonably promising bill in Washington. There's Virginia, Florida, Michigan, Colorado, Maine. There's so much going